Hello, and welcome to Contractor Outlook newscast from the coffee shops. My name is Heidi Ellsworth, and I am here today with one of my favorite economists. And you know, I love listening to a great economist. That is Alex Chausovsky. Alex, I am so excited to have you here and get caught up because so much is going on. But let's start with an introduction. So, can you tell us about you? Introduce yourself and tell us about your company.
Yes, absolutely. So, thanks for having me back. First and foremost, always enjoy being on the show. This is my first appearance as the owner and head of my own business. So, I
Yes.
feel like I'm in the same shoes as many of the listeners that are going to hear our conversation today. So, I am the president and CEO of a company called 3DM Consulting. 3DM is a acronym, stands for data driven decision making. So 3Ds and an
Nice.
M. And basically it's the microcosm of what I've been doing for the last 25 years, which is helping business leaders make critical decisions, operational, strategic, tactical, that will help them have the best possible performance and outcome regardless of what may be going on in the world around them. Sometimes that's obviously gangbusters growth. Sometimes it's mitigating the risks during a period of, softness or outright decline. And my job, as I see it, is to be pragmatic, to help them cut through the noise, and to really highlight the things not only that the data means, but what they should be doing in response to it. So can't wait to get into it with you today.
Ah, so exciting. I love it. This is something that everyone is on their mind. What should I do? How planning? And now, especially we're right now recording this in August. We're looking at 2027, which it always freaks me out in August when I start going, yeah, now I'm thinking 2027. But it is important for all of the contractors out there as they're planning and trying to figure out, what do they do with their companies, where they go. So let's kind of start big, and
Mm.
let's just start with the state of the economy and construction overall. Alex, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think that macroeconomically speaking, the economy has been nothing short of remarkable in terms of its ability to withstand the headwinds that we seem to create out of thin air sometimes,
Yes.
whether that's via tweet or via policy decision. If we look at 2025, we had a year of adjustment to tariffs. By the end of last year, we had come to understand that while it's a pain in the butt and destructive, it is not going to be the thing that makes the economy go into recession, as many people feared at the beginning of that year. Companies have adjusted, they've raised prices, they've tried to do their best to keep margins relatively stable, and have moved on with their work. Now when we looked into 2026, I think there was a lot of excitement coming into this year, a lot of expectations that the Fed might continue to cut interest rates. That should stimulate some construction activity that had been stymied by the high cost of borrowing capital and investing in new buildings and plants and equipment. And we just didn't see that occur, unfortunately, because what we did instead was we got involved in a war in the Middle East.
Oh no.
Another, from an economic perspective, policy misstep. Now you could tout the benefits in other areas, right? National security. And, so it's not a black and white issue. It's not a
Right.
right or wrong. But what I can tell you definitively by looking at the data is the accelerating growth trend that we saw in several key sectors of the economy was broken by the fact that we got involved in the Middle East. We are still growing, but that growth, in terms of industrial production, which is a great benchmark for many contractors and B2B type of players, it's growing at a 1.5% pace year over year.
Right.
So minimal, low single digit growth, nothing to celebrate, obviously. That's more of a unit measure. If you look at GDP, inflation adjusted, we're closer to 2.7% right now. That's the latest reading Q1 of 2026 compared to Q1 of 2027. And then a similar number in Q2, maybe a little bit higher. But the gist of it is, I think, if we could get out of our own way from a policy making perspective, the economy would be doing even better. And so, what I talked about earlier, which is this transition from 25 to 26, I think it really features an important concept that I want to stress to all of your listeners. If you look historically into responding to economic data, you make the best decision you can, you create a strategy, and then you focus on execution, right? You
Mhm.
just do everything you can to meet that goal that you've set for yourself. In this environment, when we have so many volatile, unpredictable policy making things getting in the way, I think a single strategy is just not enough. You have to be able to simulate different outcomes. You have to be looking at potential for different, you know, results based on what could happen rather than on
Mhm.
knowing what likely will happen, right? So, as we look out towards 2027, to your question directly, I think contractors should be asking themselves, what happens if the war doesn't come to an end? What happens if oil prices go back up over $100? I mean, the dynamic in the Middle East right now around the Strait of Hormuz is we're not any closer to a negotiated solution than we were in the spring when there was the memorandum of understanding. There's still a chasm that exists between the administration in Washington and the Iranian, whether it's the Revolutionary Guard Corps
Yeah.
or their more politically moderate, publicly facing government. I mean, the issue of who controls the Strait of Hormuz. Do they charge for passage? Do they give up their nuclear weapons? And how do they engage with the rest of the world? The most recent developments are not encouraging. So to me, I mean, we can certainly hope that the war comes to an end soon, but as we all know, hope is not a strategy. And so you've got
Right.
to be asking yourself, what does my business look like? What does my supply of materials and components look like? What does the pricing environment look like? What do my energy costs look like? In an environment where the war could potentially last into 2027.
Yeah, that man, spot on. That is so, key to what we can't we talk about this all the time. There are things you can control and there's things you cannot control, right? Unfortunately, right now, we can't control what's going on in Iran. We'd like to, but we can't. Plus, we're coming to the midterms in November, which could totally change and upheaval again. Um, we don't know what's gonna happen there. And so taking a really good look at your own company and understanding, okay, what can I control here? How do I control my expenses? How do I control my offering to make sure I am marketing to the right audience who will maybe not be affected as much by what's going on as other things. These are the conversations, Alex, I'm hearing a lot amongst contractors. One of the things I don't think people have totally gotten their head wrapped around yet is how much influence oil price has beyond just the pump, right? Everyone, with contractors with the fleets of trucks, of course, that hurts. It's terrible, but oil is a part of so many things that it influences long-term influence is going to change things too. So talk a little bit about that, the supply chain, the different things that's influencing that oil pricing is really influencing in our economy and world.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very much an underappreciated notion about how much of your business operation is affected by these interruptions, choke points all around the world in terms of supply, by the inability to get certain products because where they used to come from is no longer accessible. So I'll talk about it in a few different perspectives. Let's start locally. Okay. So,
Mhm.
a barrel of oil, people think immediately what I pay at the gas station, right? And
Right.
that's obviously up. We're currently around $4 a gallon nationwide. You look at a year ago, we were closer to $3 a gallon. So that by itself, represents a cost increase of about 33%. If you look at the transport of goods around the country, that's actually much more diesel oriented, and diesel prices are up even higher than oil. And there are some really interesting nuances. For example, if you think about the shipping and logistics industry, a lot of the trucks on the road are individual owner operator type of businesses. They're not
Mhm.
big fleet type of businesses, right? It's a guy who owns an 18-wheeler and he bids on jobs and he transports goods from point A to point B. Well, that guy has to pay the diesel costs up front. And when diesel costs are up over 50% year over year, he doesn't have the cash flow to absorb that. So
Mm-mm.
certain jobs become inaccessible to him. And in what we've seen in many cases is that these operators say, I cannot front the cash flow and wait to be reimbursed. Therefore, they're taking capacity out of the market entirely. That means that they're choosing to park their 18-wheeler and not drive rather than deal with this volatility in cost of diesel. As a result, the supply of shipping and logistics capacity is significantly diminished. That pushes prices up. So
Right.
unless you have a long-term contract locking in rates, you're paying higher prices at the spot market, even though you may not be directly affected, but just this extraction of capacity from the trucking industry is causing natural economic supply and demand rebalancing at a higher price point. So that's a tangible example of how businesses in the construction sector might be feeling higher costs, even though oil prices are down off of the $100 a barrel that we saw early in the war. We're now around $80 a barrel, but you're still paying higher prices for shipping and logistics. So
Yeah.
that's one
Al
example.
Alex, I would like to stop on that example because I think to your earlier point, there is other influences in that too that have been thrown at us, and that is recently the changes in the requirements on English language with the CDL. And so not only are owner operators can't handle the cost of diesel and just parking and saying, "I'll wait it out," or I'm gonna go find something else to do. Now we're also taking labor out of the, um out of the industry. So, I mean, we think it's bad in construction, but trucking, oh my gosh, they've had so much thrown at them.
Right. And they already have a huge deficit of truckers, right? But you talk about the CDL requirements. What about just the immigration enforcement, right? The deportations and taking people out of the country to the tune of hundreds of thousands of individuals. Now, there are obviously policy agenda items that this is aiming to address, but it's affecting the labor market, as you said.
Mhm. Yeah. Sorry, keep going. I just wanted to throw that in because we're seeing that. I mean, I think when you're in construction, all you're seeing is yes, that how immigration ICE is affecting our industry, but then taking it further out into the logistics of the distribution who is trying to deliver things, or even the manufacturers, it's putting such a squeeze. So yeah, please
Absolutely.
continue.
Yeah. Another good example, you talk about delivering things, right? So let's look at the Middle East for just a second. And, most people know at this point that 20% of oil and natural gas used to transit the Strait of Hormuz before the war started. That's basically come to a stop now. Now, some of the uh, offset of that is places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar are using more of their pipelines to transit without having to ship it on boats. But there are other key elements and materials and minerals that are affected by this. For example, 9% of global aluminum production used to happen in the Middle East and get shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that's basically come to an end as well. So, aluminum prices are up. Aluminum
Yeah.
is obviously an important building material,
Mhm.
especially at certain industries. So, the cost pressures there are very tangible. If you look at some of the petrochemical products, the stuff that gets processed out of oil and gas, right? So plastics and resins is another really good example. You hear about inflation being somewhere in the 3.5% mark, but if you look at specific measures for product categories like plastics and resins, those are up 15, 20, 25% right now because of the disruption happening in the market. And then if you look at anything that's related to, the tech sector, semiconductor industry is also hugely affected by this. Now, right now, the build out of data centers is a major, major positive force for
Mhm.
contractors and for construction companies, right? It's the one area of the market that's actually just booming, whereas everything else is a little bit of a malaise, whether you look at non-residential office, if you look at single family, multifamily to a lesser extent, right? They're all struggling in this high interest rate environment. that's coupled with a high cost of buildings in general. So data centers has been like a major growth story that a lot of companies have been able to turn to offset some of the slowdown in the rest of the market. But semiconductors are now being significantly affected because helium, which is a major input,
Yeah.
used to come from the Middle East to semiconductor companies in places like South Korea, Japan, companies like LG or Samsung, and now they can't get it anymore. They used to get as much as 90% of their helium from the
Wow.
Middle East. Now they're buying it on the open market, paying much higher prices. They can't get as much as they used to be getting before. And so that's affecting, it's kind of limiting supply of the things going into data centers. So while the building can go up, the rest of it can get filled out, so you can't move on to the next project. So it's causing a little bit of a supply chain disruption. I should say a lot of a supply chain disruption
Yeah.
in that sector that used to be fairly insulated prior to the beginning of the war.
Thing. I so many things, Alex.
So many
As
things.
I know so many things, but just this morning, listening to the news, and there was there's a lot of talk about the upcoming elections and the midterms, and that there are a lot of politicians who are running on don't have that data center in my local community, right? And so and again, I'm not going to get into right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm just saying
Right.
this is the conversation that we're having out there. And it's really interesting because just in the last little bit, in fact, we had Trent Cotney, who you may know, on this podcast, and he was talking about, how fast data centers have come on and how big it's been in the market. And he's predicting how fast it could totally shut off that fast. And so what are you seeing that direction?
Well, I think that it's important to put the scale of this trend into some perspective to understand that there might be a significant disruption and still it would be a major thing. So, for
Okay.
example, if you look at data center spending through the end of 2025 for that full calendar year, it eclipses the size of some very significant portions of the US economy. So, for example,
Wow.
it's bigger than all single family housing, it's bigger than all factory construction, it's bigger than all industrial machinery. So, the amount of capital that's been committed to this, including visibility into the next 3 to 5 years of spend, has been massive. So, could there come along something that would derail this? Yes, I think so. Absolutely. Supply chain disruptions being a important thing, but the trend itself isn't going anywhere. We've clearly committed as a not only as an industry in technology, but as a country to winning the AI race. And you
Right.
can't do that without building out the infrastructure behind that, right? And so there are elements, for example, you've probably heard some of the stories about these open source Chinese models that are competing with the American ones. Well, there's a national defense issue at play here because if you're talking about potentially the most powerful technology that has ever existed, we can't allow our adversaries to have the lead in that space, right? So I
Mhm.
think there's going to be some policy support behind this. They won't allow a complete derailment of that to happen. And so, yes, even if there are disruptive forces in play, and that might mitigate some of the growth, the amount of growth that's out there is just so vast. Here's some really interesting points of relativity. So, when we were building out the railroad network in the United
Mm.
States, we
Okay.
spent about $500 billion over a period of 70 years to do that. Okay. When we build out the highway system, we spent about 300 billion over 40 years. For build out of AI, we've spent $1 trillion over 6 years. So
Wow.
the scale of the mega projects that have been really associated with the American success story pales in comparison to how much capital is flowing into the direction of investment in AI compute. So, yes, local communities will push back against data centers. There are other ways for these things to get built, right? They will
Mhm.
find other land. They've already moved, for example, from trying to source power from the grid to getting, individualized contracts for nuclear power that's dedicated specifically to that data center. Water is a little bit more of a complex issue because water resources are not easily created, right? So that's going to continue to be a bit of a limiting factor, I think, as we look to the future. But even with these kind of obstacles in the way, the sheer determination and the scale of investment that's been allocated to the sector makes me believe that it really is different this time. And yes, disruptive forces will happen, but there's nothing that I can think of that will make data center construction not a major issue 5, 10, 20 years into the future, in my
It
mind.
it may just look different than it looks
It
today.
may look, I mean, they're talking about building submersible data centers at the bottom of the ocean. Elon Musk wants to build data centers up on the moon. He was just talking about that during their latest quarterly report. There's talk about data centers in space, which is not technically viable right now, but we've overcome other technical limitations in the past,
Right,
right? So I think industry will figure out a way. There's enough of a consensus opinion that data center technology is absolutely vital to our future that I
right.
don't see it just going away as
Yeah.
the other guest maybe postulated.
Yeah, it makes that's so and I think what we when we talk about the other guy, it was more for the contractors, the roofing contractors, because
Mm,
just to your point that, right now there's a big, contractors who are doing that, there's a huge amount, but it may shift. What if it
it
shifts
makes you
underwater?
absolutely.
That's gonna be totally a different synopsis, right? So, the data centers aren't gonna stop, but how the construction industry is building them may totally change.
Yeah, and
It's hard
that's what
telling.
I'm talking about, the scenario planning, right? Like
Yeah,
ask yourself, if the model evolves for data centers, do I have the expertise? Do I have the know-how? Do I have the right people to be able to adapt with it as it evolves? For example, if we start building data centers in a water environment, what does that require from me that I don't
yeah,
have right now? And how can I start lining these things up, right? Getting the right people in place, the right expertise in place. So, that scenario modeling that I talked about earlier is a response to all of the complexity of operating in
right.
this marketplace right now.
I wanted to work with a supplier partner I respect.
I wanted a partner who respected me.
We needed a partner with employees who care as much as we do.
We needed a partner who values relationships.
I wanted a partner that would help me grow my business.
We needed a partner that would help us succeed.
SRS Distribution delivers more than building products. SRS delivers customer success.
Yeah, so interesting, so interesting. Okay, I wanna switch a little bit because this is
Sure.
something I've been really interested in. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but that's the stock market, right? So, there's this myth, this connection that we are not all getting because the stock market has done well. We've seen our 401ks do well, but yet we're like, okay, but over here, the economy is challenging. There's inflation and everything costs more. So, talk to us just kind of about the stock market and the economy right now and how that's all interrelated and what's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Let me say caveat. This is not financial advice. So,
Yeah,
I'm not a
right.
financial advisor. So, legally I'm protected in just offering my opinion on this. But
Yeah.
um, to put it very simply, the stock market and the economy are not the same. And they are driven by very different forces. And there's actually very minimal correlation, only about a 50% correlation between movement in the economy versus movement in the stock market. So when I look at the stock market and try to understand what's happening right now, I look at kind of 2 to 3 different areas. The first area that I look at is the understanding that while the macro environment might be doing well overall, when you look at the details, when you look at the different segments of the economy, certainly when you look at the different segments of the population, it's not all the same. And what we are absolutely, in my mind, operating in is a K shaped economy. That means that there are winning sectors and winning consumers, and then there are those that are lagging and struggling, right? So if you look, for example, at consumption, which is when people spend money to live their day-to-day lives, going out to restaurants, going to concerts, buying clothing, electronics, furniture, all the things that we consume, that accounts for about 2/3 of the overall economy. And the general way that I track consumption activity is retail, right? So
Mhm.
there's one data series in particular. It's called Advanced Retail Trade and Food Services. It's very all-encompassing. It's about $9 trillion by itself. And so that's a good benchmark for, is the consumer still able to maintain the spending that we've been doing to keep the economy going? And I can tell you right now, it's accelerating. It's up 4% year over year. It's up 6% quarter over quarter. But that acceleration is driven only by the top 20% of income earners. Basically, households that are making $150,000 or more combined in income, they now account for 60% of all spending. So 20% of income earners account for 60% of all spending.
Wow.
The bottom 80%, that means everyone in the middle class and those that are in the bottom quintile, they're accounting for only 40%. So 80% of the population is accounting for only 40% of the spend. And it's the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And it's a really good explanation for why the economy, in terms of measured by data, might be doing well. But you look at consumer confidence, whether that's from the University of Michigan index or the Conference Board index, it is at almost record lows. In fact, the Conference Board data says that we are as pessimistic right now on the economic front as we were in Q2 of 2020 when we shut down the economy in response to COVID, which is obviously remarkable. You know, the data doesn't justify that at all. And yet the vibes that we have, the way that we feel, talk, and think about the economy with our neighbors, our family, our friends is very pessimistic, very negative, right? Now, there's a difference between action and words. And so the action says, as a country, we continue to spend and push the economy forward. As in terms of the emotional part, the words, very, very negative. So, it's easy to say the economy is doing well, but your mileage might vary, as they say. Your personal experience could be very, very different than what the macroeconomic data suggests. So that's, I think, one thing to keep in mind. And this applies also to the industrial space, the B2B side of things, right? There are sectors like aerospace, computers and electronics, industrial machinery doing quite well right now. There are also sectors like housing or automotive sales that are doing very poorly right now. So it's not an across the board type of growth perspective, right? Now, turning our attention to the second piece that I look at with the stock market is I always go back to the fundamentals and say, is the valuation of the company compared to the future expectations of earnings for that company, is that justified? And I would say the stock market right now is, above historic average in terms of that valuation, but it's not nearly as elevated, for example, as it was, 20 years ago in the run-up of 2000s, because what we see is a consistent outperformance, specifically of these tech companies that are now driving much of the stock market versus expectations. So if you look at, for example, the Q2 quarterly reporting that they've just finishing up right now, over 85% of all companies in the S&P 500 exceeded earnings expectations in Q2 and revised their future earnings guidance upwards. That means that they expect to be making more money in the future than the consensus estimate. And so what that means is that their price to earnings ratio gets recalculated. That means that, yes, they are expensive, but if you're telling me you're going to be making even more money in the future than you thought last quarter, then perhaps the valuation is not as disconnected from reality as some people would have you believe. So, it's been remarkable to watch through tariffs, outside of a brief kind of pause to growth in response to Liberation Day last year, through the war, the stock market is at record highs. It's really absolutely incredible. And it's because I think that particularly those companies that are driving much of the stock market's growth, which is the large technology firms, continue to show evidence that they are able to make higher profits. They are able to guide expectations into the future upwards. And there is some early evidence that the investment in AI is starting to pay off. Like they're actually being able to be more productive, do more with less. And so I think that those elements, whether you say, okay, who's investing in the stock market versus are the valuations justified, that creates the economic environment right now where the stock market can be doing as well as it is, despite the fact that we have these significant headwinds from a policy making perspective.
So interesting. And I think when 85% are projecting growth, that's powerful. And most
Yeah.
of those, but a lot of that is centered around technology.
It is.
Um,
It is. And the investment that's happening in the AI infrastructure play, as we have been discussing.
mhm. Wow. I know we're at the end of our things, but I'm going to ask one last question because it goes around AI and it goes everything. But one of the things that we're seeing out there is a jobs report, and the jobs report is really, it's not going down, but it's not going up too much. It's just kind of right there. And I keep looking and I keep thinking AI has to be influencing this. That people are not laying off, but they're not hiring. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So let's talk about where the pain is the most acute. And that's, of course, the tech space, programming, computer science. We've had about 150,000 or so layoffs in that space attributed to AI. I think that it's
Hmm.
more of a story of the companies overextended themselves in terms of the capex necessary to build out those very same data centers. And now they're justifying that in having to do some layoffs. But I think that we have to remember that while it's very painful for the people losing their jobs, right? The 150,000 folks that are no longer employed, that's a very small percentage of the total US labor force. We have 165 million people working in the United States. So, it's less than 1/10 of 1%.
Yeah.
So, in the big picture scheme, I don't see that affecting the labor market to any significant degree. What I do see companies doing is not hiring as much
Yeah.
because they're able to have their people do more than they were able to do before through the implementation of AI. So I think that there is a natural kind of churn that's being allowed to happen, whether it's through retirement or people taking other jobs and companies not filling those positions again, which is why you see the labor market numbers kind of drop off, especially this latest data point showed that, it's not a bad labor market, but it's not a great one. It's certainly not an easy one for people looking for work. But if you have a job, you're relatively safe. You're not going to be fired as a general comment as a result of AI. And that's really what I look at the end of the day, layoffs, right? If you look at the layoffs data, there is absolutely no evidence that there's any kind of spike in layoff activity happening, whether it's AI driven or economically driven. So I think that the most recent comments, particularly from the CEOs of the AI companies, that AI is going to take everybody's jobs. Even they themselves are starting to walk that back a little bit. They're starting to realize that it's more nuanced than that, more complex than that. You can't just replace every facet of a person's job. There's something, a concept called weak links. So if you look at any position, there's a potential to automate up to, call it 75 to 80% of that position, but it's the 20% that requires a human being that is impossible to automate. And that means that AI is not just going to come for everybody's jobs. Our jobs are going to evolve. We're going to focus more on that element that requires the human being, but we're not going to be replaced by machines or AI, at least not in the near term future. Now, I
Yeah.
do think that when we look out further, the cross section of robotics and AI presents a really interesting challenge. And there's a lot of work on convergence happening right now. There's a lot of great progress, especially by robotics companies out of China. They're now like field testing workers in remote conditions. They don't always look like humanoid robots. Sometimes they're purpose built for the specific task. Like in rural areas of China, there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of machines checking the maintenance and like reliability of the electric network, for example. So instead of having a person have to go into a remote region, they drone over a machine, drop it in the location. It's able to do all the testing and confirming, and in some cases, even make some minor repairs as well. And so I
Wow.
think that down the road, that kind of thing is coming. So when we look at, a future 10, 20 years down the road, could most construction workers on the job site be robotic with a few human supervisors and to address the tasks that the robots can't do? Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. But technology has always caused human beings to evolve and to develop
Mm-hmm.
new jobs, right? So many of the jobs of the mid 2030s, the 2040s, we can't even fathom what they are. And I know that for a fact because we have a perfect example, right? Think about the proliferation of the smartphone. That was as recently as 2007 that we got the
Right.
first iPhone. Now think about the industries, entire industries employing millions of people that are now in existence that didn't exist before. Food delivery, Uber and Lyft, in terms of the driving side, and then the list goes on and on and on. So I think what we'll see is an evolution of labor, more towards the human, the creative, the value add stuff, repetitive tasks, things that are easy to automate. We're going to want the machines doing that as long as we can find a new way to apply ourselves that is more human in nature. So overall, I think right now, to conclude, I would say labor market is not being massively disrupted by AI currently. I think that there are other forces like the immigration
Yes.
enforcement and the retirement of the massive wave of baby boomers that's happening right now that are having a greater current impact than AI. Down the road, I do think that kind of cross section of AI and robotics presents a very interesting evolution for all of us to figure out.
I think so too. I think so too. Wow. Well, Alex, as always, so interesting. I learned so much. I love these conversations. So we'll have you back again.
Sounds great, Heidi. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Thank you, SRS, as our sponsor for the Contractor Outlook newscast, because I have to tell you, it is so informational for all construction and for all the trades when you have someone like Alex sharing insights and where we're going. So please check out all of our Contractor Outlook newscasts under the RLW sections of all the coffee shop platforms. Be sure to subscribe and set those notifications so you don't miss a single episode. We'll be seeing you again next time on Contractor Outlook Newscast.